I just got that. So to me, this work that takes something special and takes something.
All right, guys, we are ready to get started. Last presentation of the day. Thank you so much for hanging in there today and being with me this afternoon. My name is Sarah Robinson. I am the inaugural Justice for Victims Fellow with the Institute. In my position, I have the esteemed privilege of providing direct legal services to victims and survivors of trafficking. And what that predominantly looks like or takes the form of is engaging in post-conviction relief. That means cleaning up records for those who have unjust convictions for crimes related to their trafficking victimization. I'm also honored to be co-presenting today with Tammy McDonnell. She is a survivor and one of my former clients, and so we're going to be talking to you about our relationship, the attorney-client relationship, and working together to successfully vacate her convictions in Philadelphia County. Every time we talk about that, I realize it's kind of counterintuitive to say she got vacated, she doesn't have a criminal record, but bringing that point up. But we're doing that so that you can all get the benefit of us working together. The vacator practice in Pennsylvania on the whole is still very developing. Our law has only been on the books for 4 years or so, and when we started filing these motions at the Institute, we were one of the first to do it in many of the counties. There was one other one that was filed in Allegheny County prior to us taking over the project. So it is a developing area of law. I don't think this works. Working together with survivors is, in trauma-informed lawyering is also a developing concept and practice. And so we're here to share with you what we've learned and hopefully collaborate and get some advice from you all as well. Just before we begin, I want to get a sense of who's in the room. I know a lot of my friends in the room, but if you could please just raise your hand if you are a licensed attorney, practicing lawyer. Excellent, excellent. How about social workers? Great. Policy, legislative reform, advocates, excellent. And anyone that I missed? Anybody have a position? Yes, would you like to share?
Court.
Oh, okay. And are you a judge or a clerk?
No, I actually have one of the projects I work on. I'm with the administrative office.
Okay, excellent.
So one of the projects I work on is a stop grant, and the purpose of that is to educate and train judges and court staff.
That's fantastic. And do I see your hand? Yes. What do you do?
I work with an association of shelter providers around the U.S.
Okay. Yes, I heard you in another presentation. I was like, that's a really cool collaborative thing. So that's great because vacator is actually something that we have all across the United States. And as you can imagine, trafficking victims have convictions typically from many different jurisdictions, many different states. And so it does complicate the process. Steph, can you figure out how to get this to work for me? I know. Sometimes too much technology is a bad thing. It won't quit through at all.
I think you have to oh wait, really? Hold on.
Well, I know what the next slide says. The next slide are your learning objectives. So either way, we have to get through this information. If it's just going to be me lecturing the whole time, we'll try to make it interesting for you. But after you leave this room, I want you to have a concrete understanding of Pennsylvania vacator law and a little bit of understanding about the history of vacator and why it's so special and critical for survivors. I'd also like you all to be able to appreciate other legal remedies that are available to victims, including courtroom protections and ways that we can make our courtrooms more trauma-informed. I'd also like you to be aware of how psychological trauma impacts those that you work with, not only in their recovery, separate and apart from you, but also in their recovery and their access to specialized services. It's something that's going to be not always front and center, but something that's woven throughout their life. And so as responsible service providers, it is our obligation to be aware of the origins and the impacts of trauma. I would also like you all, if you are attorneys, to be able to leave the room with a basic understanding of what it means to engage in trauma-informed lawyering. That concept has kind of developed recently. The American Bar Association has tenets for trauma-informed lawyering. We have law review articles on the pedagogy of trauma-informed lawyering. And I would really like to see it brought to Villanova Law School and other law schools in our area, but it is still a developing concept and something that legal professionals are just now understanding the importance of. So are we not going to be able to do this? Okay.
Up there.
I'm so sorry. I should have provided the slides to you all then, but if you'd like, I can send them out to you after the presentation. The first portion of what I prepared for you is really dense in terms of the law, and so if there's something that I say or go over that doesn't make sense, or I use a term that's not familiar to you, please just let me know, speak up, okay? So, in Pennsylvania, inside our comprehensive anti-trafficking statute, yay, go next. Great, go next. Thanks, Tammy. Okay, well, why is post-conviction relief important? Post-conviction relief is an umbrella term for ways to help someone with their criminal history, their criminal record, after the fact that they have a conviction. So we are going to be talking about vacator, vacating a conviction, going back in time and nullifying it and saying, you know what, we were wrong. When you were convicted of this crime, in fact, you were factually innocent. So for survivors, it can be a major source of empowerment, and it can really remedy a past injustice. It's an opportunity for the system to take responsibility for failing to identify someone as a victim of trafficking. My favorite reason of why post-conviction relief is important is because of the impact that it can have on criminal justice stakeholders and decision makers. The ripple effect that is generated by our motion practice with vacator, although it's small and piecemeal and individual at times, we have seen that there's a greater understanding of trafficking, but frankly commercial sexual exploitation on the whole. And we're able to communicate that to decision makers and the judiciary because in filing these motions, most of the time, all you have to go on to prove your case or to prove your motion are the words and testimony of the client. And so that requires us to tell their story, in essence. And that helps us educate the judiciary on the many different ways that this crime manifests, the many different ways that people get involved in the life, stay in the life, and we use it as an opportunity to explain all of those nuances. Yeah, do you think the clicky works? Yeah. So, very temperamental in this room. No, I'll still hold it. Makes me feel good. Thanks. Well, this doesn't work, so.
The clicker still?
Yes. So, this map, has anyone ever seen this map before? It was prepared by the American Bar Association. They have a project called the Survivor Reentry Project. That's a wonderful resource. It's headed by Kate Mogilescu, who's a professor at Brooklyn Law. They have a human trafficking intervention or human trafficking prevention clinical there, where students work directly with survivors and they engage in this exact type of work that we do in our fellowship program. And it's a tremendous resource. They have a legal guide for practicing attorneys that answers any and all of your questions related to vacator motion practice. They even provide, briefs, examples of pleadings. They're there for technical assistance. And they put together this map as well as a state report card system that they just did last month. Yeah, in March. And anybody want to guess what grade Pennsylvania got for our law? A C? An F? Yeah, we got an F. I'd like to say it's an F plus. My boss, Shay Rhodes, and I, we get into a disagreement. I think our law has this amazing provision in that we apply our law to more than one misdemeanor, more than one eligible offense. We actually have 6 crimes that someone can ask to vacate. And most of the states up here, including our neighboring states of New Jersey, I don't see Kelsey in here. There's another attorney who does this in New Jersey. They only do prostitution, and that's it. But we have 6 different crimes, and I think that's pretty great. What's not great about our law is that we have to basically go and kiss the ring of a district attorney in order to even file the motion. And I'll get into what that looks like, but that's the tug, that's the push and pull here with the law. So there are definitely some amendments that need to be made, but in terms of national scope, there are only 6 states remaining that don't have any type of vacator law. Some of the states only restrict these laws to minors or people who had juvenile adjudications for trafficking-related crimes, and some only provide sealing. So the difference is that it's still accessible to the government, and you don't get that same messaging of actually this needs to be nullified. The conviction remains on their record, it just is hidden from public view. So that takes care of 2 of those reasons why I think post-conviction relief is great. You know, it gets rid of some barriers to housing, but it doesn't take it to the full extent, in my opinion, of empowerment. Thanks for being my... Okay, so I just want to go through expungement and compare it to vacator so that we can all be on the same playing field here with understanding these different forms of relief. Every single person in this room, if you've ever been arrested for a crime and you were not convicted of that crime, you are eligible for expungement. Okay? So no conviction, you can get the arrest, you can get any court-related data, you can get it all erased off your record. And in Pennsylvania, we have 67 counties that have different rules and they set different prices for filing fees. But it is something that anyone is eligible for. You don't have to be in a special class or population. Again, it erases information off of your record, and there should be no court costs associated. There are filing fees, but no costs on that crime, on that case. Something else related to expungement is called a partial redaction. So typically when someone is arrested and charged with a crime, it's not just one crime that they end up being charged with. It's going to be the primary offense and then a few secondary offenses. So for example, with prostitution, at least in Pennsylvania, a person will be arrested for selling sex, which is 5902A, but they will also be charged with criminal solicitation, which is section 902 of our crimes code. Typically what happens is they take a plea to the prostitution charge, and because they're agreeing to take this plea, then the other charge is dropped or withdrawn. So you end up having a conviction in connection with a non-conviction. If we didn't have vacator, what we would do for that case is a partial redaction. And if you're going to be working with survivors on cleaning up their records, this is especially important if they've been charged with a felony. Because typically, you have a felony case and you take a good plea deal, you're going to be pleading out to a misdemeanor. But that felony non-conviction stays on your record. So even if we can't vacate it, we can't expunge it, you can still get a redaction of that portion of the record. Does that make sense? Great. So vacator is fantastic because it is exclusively for sex trafficking victims. My one issue and frustration with this is I don't understand why it would not be available to labor trafficking victims as well. Anyone have any argument? I just don't understand.
Labor.
Well, inside of our comprehensive anti-trafficking statute, the crimes related to human trafficking apply to both sex trafficking and labor trafficking, sexual servitude and labor servitude. And so if you're a victim of labor trafficking and you commit a crime as a result of being victimized, say your employer, your trafficker, forces you to drive without a license, and then you get, convicted of driving without a license. They should be able to get that off their record, don't you think? Yes. So that's one of those things that we want to fix in our statute, is to broaden it up to labor trafficking victims. And at this point, it would make Pennsylvania the only state that does offer that remedy to labor trafficking victims as well. Okay, next. Thank you. So here are those 6 offenses. Criminal trespass, disorderly conduct, loitering and prowling at nighttime, obstruction of the highway, which used to be charged a lot for prostitution. It's not anymore. Kind of went away in the early 2000s. Prostitution itself, 5902A, and simple possession of a controlled substance. Does anyone need an explanation of what any of these crimes are? Okay. Other offenses that I would consider, and I like to get creative with these motions, possession of drug paraphernalia. Because if you read the statute very closely, it doesn't actually define the section of the crimes code like it did for those other ones, like 5503 or 5902. It doesn't really mention that. So I think that you can get creative and say this was derivative of simple possession. You can also get creative with people that are convicted or found guilty of contempt of court. Oftentimes, someone who's on probation may violate probation and be held in contempt. But you can argue, even though that's not one of the enumerated, crimes in the statute, that it was derivative to the crime that was included in the statute. So, and then I include possession of a weapon or an instrument of crime, because in the state of New York, there's some really fantastic case law where attorneys got creative with those cases and advocated to include those crimes as well, because their client was arrested for prostitution, but she also had a gun. And she was using the gun to protect herself. So they were able to tie that in, the nexus to the crime, and make a compelling argument, and they persuaded the court in New York. We're not really there yet in Pennsylvania, but in terms of possession of an instrument of crime, I wanted to be sure that you all were aware that in Allegheny County, they have taken to some pretty interesting charging practices, whereby they are charging women who are arrested with prostitution not only with selling sex, but also with possessing an instrument of a crime, we call it PIC, when they have condoms on their person. Or, so there was a journalist who revealed this information, and immediately, somewhat immediately after, they stopped charging that, but instead they started charging for possessing a cell phone. Okay, so if those things are going to be related, if those things are going to influence charging decisions, I think that they should be included in a motion to vacate as well. Okay, so our vacator statute requires us to prove, as I said before, that these crimes were committed as a result of being victimized. So you have to almost, you have to prove your case. And in some instances, victims are actually able to get state certified. Again, in New York, they have a means of certifying a person as a sex trafficking or human trafficking victim. We don't have that here in Pennsylvania. But you are able to use some government documentation and some official documentation in order to create a presumption that the person who's moving for this relief was a victim of trafficking. What does that look like? Transcripts from, the trafficker's indictment or the, grand jury indictment, or, a transcript from court if the victim testified. But 9 times out of 10 or 99 times out of 100, you're not going to have that kind of information. And all you're going to have is the individual person's experience and their credibility in terms of going into the system and asking the system for relief yeah, their credibility is impaired, right? They're considered a criminal, and you have to prove you're not a criminal. And we're still very far behind in terms of stigma and stereotypes around prostitution and drug use here in Pennsylvania. So it can be really helpful if you end up having a hearing to solicit expert testimony. We recently had a hearing down in Philadelphia County, and we had Dr. Marianne Layden, who is a clinical psychologist and runs a program out of Penn University. She came and she explained why a person would engage in behavior repeatedly, even though there was a legal deterrent. Because in Pennsylvania, the crime of prostitution recidivizes, so the more you do it, the more trouble you get into, and that's supposed to work to keep someone from doing it. But in reality, we know it doesn't. So we had to explain to the judge why my client was continuing to get arrested for prostitution, even though she knew it was a crime.
Could you say the name of the expert that is?
Mary Ann Layden, Layden. She's phenomenal. She's like, I want to make t-shirts out of what she says. She's like, well, prostitution's violence. And I'm like, she's like, don't you know? And that's why we're really here to talk to you today, me and Tammy, because in order to prove what happened to Tammy and to get her convictions vacated, we had to file an affidavit. We had to go through and rely on her testimony in order to prove that nexus to trafficking. And in doing that, there's no way to avoid trauma. There's absolutely no way. We're not going to stand here and pretend that, well, okay, we're going to avoid triggering someone. That's part of the process. But in order to be responsible and ethical and, frankly, just a good person, you need to take some steps toward mitigating that trauma and making sure that there are wraparound services in order to do the least harm possible, but also get the outcome you want for your client. So this is just boring case law stuff. Basically what I have it up here to tell you is that there's no time restriction. These are also New York cases, but there's no time restriction on asking for this. And thank God for that. We have a client who was trafficked in the 70s, and she just considered it a part of life until recently she was at a program at her church, and they were talking about human trafficking and commercial sexual exploitation. And 40 years later, this light bulb goes off in her head, and she realizes, I was trafficked. And lo and behold, her trafficker has a conviction for pimping. So that makes it pretty easy to prove for us, especially considering the fact that records from 40 years ago, we can't even see the police report. But so there's no time limit. There's no time constraint on figuring out that you're a victim of trafficking. There's also no time constraint on, well, you were only in the life for 6 months, and so you're not really eligible for that. This is the case where the petitioner was able to get weapons possession off her record because the judge went above and beyond and considered it to be a direct result of the victimization. And then this last case, Nelson v. Colorado, is very important. It's actually U.S. v. Nelson because this is the case, and it's quite recent, you can see. It tells us when someone has a conviction vacated, any and all money that they've paid into that case, including court costs and fines and filing fees, is owed back to them. So that's very restorative and very helpful for survivors, and anyone really who's in need of money in order to get that money back. It's fantastic.
Who pays it back?
What's that?
Who pays it back?
The court, yeah, because it's paid into the court. Unless it's restitution, you can't really, well, I guess this says that restitution gets absolved, but what I've experienced anecdotally is that restitution, especially when you're asking a court to modify court costs, that's something that can't be altered. But in these cases with prostitution and these crimes, they're not typically crimes against another person, violent crimes or theft, and so there should be no restitution at all. Okay. That beeping means it's going to shut down. I don't know. Couple other special issues, things that I want lawyers to be aware of if they want to engage in this practice. You definitely want to consider whether there are pending criminal matters, although it's not required by the statute, and I could stand up here and talk about how you can't get in the way of someone's legal right to file a motion like this. You also want to think, okay, if they have an open criminal case, maybe we wait until that's resolved. So there are a few informal time constraints. Maybe they're still on probation. And that's just a matter of appearances and optics. And that's a decision for your strategy between you and your client. You want to address any active warrants first. Of course, we don't want to file something with someone's name on it and an address and make it clear where they are and open them to, possible incarceration or arrest. Of course, you also want to think about immigration consequences, which is something I know very little about, but I do have cohorts in other organizations in Philadelphia and throughout PA who I refer any foreign national client to immediately in order to get an immigration triage first before we engage with the criminal justice system. And then lastly, you want to be thinking about your client's stability and readiness to engage in this. And yesterday, Tammy and I presented at the Pennsylvania Council on Children, Youth, and Families conference in Harrisburg. And Tammy was talking a little bit about her experience working with me and had shared that she wasn't sure if she even wanted to go through with it at first because it sounded like a lot of work. And I was like, oh my gosh, I didn't intend to, make her feel like she had to do any work at all. But then through some reflection, I'm like, of course it's a lot of work, right? You have to meet with a lawyer. You have to, share stories with a lawyer. You might even have to go to court. You have to, correspond with your lawyer in a timely fashion. And you have to be ready to do this. And so it's important as an attorney and as a client for us to mutually recognize that we're doing this together. And that it requires both of us to engage meaningfully in order to get the outcome we want. And sometimes people just aren't ready, and that's why it's fine we have no requirement on filing. I have some clients who disappear for months at a time and come back, and that's all just part of the practice and part of working with survivors. So back to that sticky little, procedural flaw about how we have to ask district attorneys for permission to file our motions. I see Stephanie giving me a look. So some considerations. Who is the right district attorney to approach? If you're not from Philadelphia, you may have not heard of Larry Krasner if you're not from Pennsylvania. But in Philadelphia, we have a very liberal district attorney. His name is Larry Krasner. And he has been a tremendous advocate for us, and his office has taken a very fantastic liberal view of these motions, and we have their full support. That's great. I can't clone Larry Krasner and get him into office. I'm not even sure if I want to, but that's a conversation for another day. But we are not seeing that kind of open-mindedness with respect to our motions in other counties in Pennsylvania, neighboring counties with Philadelphia. So you want to be figuring out who is the right person, and it's not just the elected prosecutor. It's not just the elected DA that you can go to. It's any attorney for the Commonwealth. And so there may be someone who's, say, in a family violence unit or sexual violence unit who has better understanding of these crimes than going to, the blue-collar crime, the white-collar crime person. Same thing goes for the right judge. Those of us who, practice criminal law know that judges have difference of opinions, and that can impact or influence the way that they rule on cases. And so you can see these biases play out very clearly in the courtroom. So just be mindful that you don't want to put a motion like this in front of a judge who thinks that, just doesn't think well of women in the life. I'll just leave it at that. Also, you need to leverage your network and other public interest law firms. So, as I said earlier, we have started really taking over this practice, but I'm not familiar with every judge in Bucks County or every DA in Chester County. So I'm partnering with local law firms and with public interest law firms in order to really take advantage of their relationships and their networks so that we can have the most effective advocacy for our clients. Okay. So here is the process from start to finish, and when you see it visually like this, then you can appreciate why both Tammy and I are like, it's a lot of work. It takes a long time, and that's something that you need to express to your client or to your client if they are doing this, that I'm with you, it's going to take a long time. It takes roughly 6 months because in order to even get the expungement aspect of it done post-filing, that's a 3-month requirement in order for all of the parties that have the data and the information to actually go through with erasing the information. So that's just on the back end. But 3 months on the front end is kind of quick in order to meet with the client, form the relationship, build the rapport, do the affidavit interview, perfect your draft, get it in front of a DA, get a DA, email the DA 2 weeks later, email the DA 1 month later, and really hound them and then hoping that they actually will sign off no objection to your motion. So it's a long process.
Next.
Yep. Okay. So now I want to talk to you guys about something I know very little about, trauma. My friends from Salvation Army in the front row, I think, could do a much better job of explaining it. But who's had a training on trauma before? Almost everyone in the room. Okay. I've sat through 1 or 2 trainings on trauma, but I think the experience is life's greatest educator. And so working with survivors of trauma has been the most illuminating experience for me. Law school didn't teach me how to work with survivors of trauma, but you don't have to be a therapist in order to be therapeutic. And I think it's essential for anyone working with survivors or anyone, frankly, with a legal issue to have a basic understanding of trauma on a scientific level and also on an interpersonal level. So what do we got? So what is trauma? Trauma is a response to an abnormal experience. It's a normal response and it's a subjective response, meaning it's not going to look the same to every single person. Just as coercion and what compels someone or puts someone under duress is subjective, so is trauma. It is a normal reaction, as I said, to something abnormal. Thank you, Tammy. Okay, here's where it gets dicey for me. You want to do it? Okay. This is why I didn't go to medical school. Okay. So you have all of these pieces working together in someone who has experienced trauma. And let's not even talk about, sex trafficking or prostitution right now. Let's just consider any type of trauma that someone may experience. There are going to be all of these elements. You're going to see an overactive amygdala. That is the part of the brain that controls your fight, flight, or freeze response, right? The part of your brain that assesses your fear and whether it's credible. And so with trafficking survivors, what we see is that response or that ability to regulate your fight, flight, or freeze reflexes is often stuck in the on position. And so they sense fear, they feel fear, or threat to safety when it may not actually be credible. Trauma survivors also have an impaired prefrontal cortex. Prefrontal cortex is the part of someone's brain that regulates their social behaviors, their interactions with other people, and this is something that takes a long time to develop in people. Is it like age 26 or 25 until it's fully developed? So you can only imagine if the onset of trauma was childhood, which is commonly the case for victims of commercial sexual exploitation, that the prefrontal cortex has been impaired from that point on. There's also the role of an altered hippocampus functioning, and the hippocampus is the part of your brain that encodes memories and makes cognitive decisions, makes choices, thinking part of your brain. And so you can only imagine in working with a survivor to detail their experiences how these three pieces, but predominantly the hippocampus not functioning well, is going to impact your ability to tell that story. There's going to be gaps in time. There's going to be like no memory at all of whereabouts or how someone got somewhere. And so as practitioners, it's very important for us not to, misinterpret that as a person lying about what happened to them or evading telling the truth, but to really appreciate that it could simply just be a neurobiological effect of trauma. The last thing that I included on here is epigenetic trauma, and I know that some studies have been done to understand the role of, familial trauma, communal trauma, and trauma that carries out throughout generations. I think it was rats. Is that the animal? Okay, so they did a study on baby rats, and what it revealed was that there's credible evidence that trauma is something that can be encoded in your genes. And so not only is a person, a nature versus nurture issue, it's both. So that's my best explanation of that. Was that okay? All right. I guess it's important to say, too, that this is, this kind of basic understanding or being able to say, like, this is the best that I know, that's actually part of this practice, right? Is just being transparent and saying, I'm pretty sure that means this, and almost going through it with your client at the same time. Like, I don't really know what that is, but let's find out together. So having humility is very important. So there's two different types of trauma, two main types of trauma. You've got natural disasters, natural trauma, and you have man-made trauma. Natural disasters, car fires, house fires, car accidents, tsunamis, things like that, where absolutely it's a traumatic, abnormal experience and people are feeling traumatized by it, which is completely normal and acceptable. Then we also have trauma at the hands of other people who deliberately hurt others. And this type of trauma is exceptionally difficult to overcome, especially if the onset is in childhood or early adolescence, because it encourages a person to normalize the abuse and to normalize the feelings of being exploited or traumatized to the extent where they almost derive comfort from the feeling of being traumatized because it is so familiar. And Dr. Layden, the expert, speaks very well on this. She calls it like a normalization, adaptive behaviors, and definitely check out what she has to say about those things. Okay, next. So here are some of the tactics that a trafficker might use. And I feel like most of us in the room work with trafficking survivors. We have some interest. We're here today. So you know what it looks like, but just to bring some of these issues up in this context of thinking about man-made trauma and what does it mean to have someone brutally abuse you and put you through so many horrific experiences, sometimes on a daily basis, sometimes for decades at a time. How much is that going to really sit with a person and impact them in terms of trauma. So, you know, you can read for yourself. There's just endless different ways that traffickers will condition a victim that do end up singularly they're traumatic, together they're, you know, compounded trauma, and it's just really horrific. We also have the phenomenon of trauma bonding. Has anyone heard that term? Do you guys want to give a definition?
Yeah, that's fun. You don't have to. I mean, it's what people have typically known as Stockholm Syndrome. Have anyone heard of Stockholm Syndrome? So yeah, so it would be when, you know, someone, and we're obviously talking about trafficking, who's been in a situation and they actually have an emotional connection to the person that's been hurting them. There actually has been some interesting studies done on when someone has the ability to hurt you and they don't, and like the actual like emotional connection that you'll feel to them when they don't hurt you. So it's counterintuitive to us who maybe haven't been in that situation, but to have someone who has the power to hurt you and has hurt you, but in that moment they don't, you automatically feel this benevolence and like care and like love for them. And so it creates this like very interesting, is not the right word, but it, you know, is kind of, you know, an interesting psychological phenomenon that occurs when people get connected to their trafficker.
That's awesome. Exactly. So it has been trauma bonding, traumatic bonding has been compared to Stockholm Syndrome. And in some of my research, I found that it's more proper now to refer to Stockholm Syndrome as survival identification syndrome. And that speaks to exactly what you just said, which is that I know I can navigate this. And I'm familiar with my traffickers, you know, triggers or outbursts, moods. And I know that if I just stay here and I just do this, then I'm safe. But if I attempt to do something different, God forbid I attempt to escape, I don't know what will happen. And so again, it's that kind of feeling of at least what's familiar and what feels normal to me is something that I can overcome and navigate, but it's the unknowns that really can, you know, cause a problem. But there is this power and control wheel that has been, you know, used and displayed in the domestic violence realm for decades now, and it's actually been adapted for human trafficking, both labor and sex, and explains some of those behaviors and tactics that traffickers use in order to exert power and control over their victims. But again, it's this cycle of abuse where there's this rewards and punishments and you don't really know what's going to happen. That creates a powerful emotional bond for people, not only to their traffickers, but I would argue that a trauma bond can be formed between two victims and also perhaps a victim to the lifestyle as well. So it's one of the biggest barriers to recovery for trafficking victims, because it does make them very resistant to change. No, that's good. So some of the physiological and psychological effects of trauma, again, there is that impaired sense of safety, always having the heightened and aroused amygdala, the fear that I need to protect myself or I need to be on guard, disassociating from reality, being really withdrawn. We see this in presentation of victims where, you know, some people will expect them to be bawling and completely unconsolable, but instead they're feisty, they're aggressive, they have a different attitude than what you would expect of someone who's been through trafficking. There's difficulty making decisions and choices, and of course there's, you know, PTSD, depression, anxiety, a lot of mental health issues that go along with suffering from complex trauma. So these are the tenets of trauma-informed care, and I want you to keep these in your mind's eye because I'm going to later show you the tenets of trauma-informed lawyering, and I want you to be able to see some similarities between those two. But trauma-informed care is built on 5 values: emotional and physical safety, trustworthiness, choice, which is number 1, collaboration, and empowerment. You can keep going. Okay, so let's just for a second live in my ideal world and make an assumption that law is a healing profession. Cute, right? You like it? I argue this because, at least in the public interest sphere, law is a human service. It is everywhere, and we do a social service as well. But anytime someone is coming to an attorney or a law firm, they have a problem, and they need to, at least the first time, ask a stranger to help them. And if they don't, if it's not a stranger, it's someone who knows them very well, was referred by a family member, and that's because engaging in an attorney-client relationship can be really intimate. And so you want to be sure that you're working with someone that you can trust, that has the same values as you, that won't, have any judgment against you. As I said earlier, you don't have to be a therapist in order to be therapeutic. And when I first started doing this work, I felt a internal opposition to, doing anything that I considered outside my scope of services. I'm not going to give you a hug. I'm not going to, we're not going to sit here together while you cry. I tried very hard because I'm a very emotional person. I could get wrapped up in that very quickly. But sometimes maintaining professional boundaries with such rigidity is actually doing a disservice to your client and putting space between you where if you could develop it with more trust and with empathy, you'll have a better outcome on the whole. So in order to be an effective advocate, you must have an understanding of both your client and your own trauma and its origins and impacts. Otherwise, it can get really messy. We can keep going because, I want to give you a lot of time to talk. So your attorney, as an attorney or working with an attorney, I want them to be able to appreciate their role as an emotional translator. And that's where it comes in with educating the judiciary. You need to be able to understand your client's trauma and use it to your client's benefit, use it to your case's benefit, be able to anticipate when there's going to be triggers of trauma, and also respond to those. Respond to them appropriately. We're not going to do any additional harm, and use it as a way to push the matter forward. This is just to drive home the point that it's not just vacator practice, it's not just sex trafficking victims, but there are additional legal consequences or legal concerns that survivors face. So myself and Jamie, who I just realized I failed to introduce, this is Jamie Peasy. She's our other Justice for Victims legal fellow and engages in vacator practice. So Jamie and I alternate weeks at the Kensington Drop-In Center that's run by the Salvation Army, some of my friends in the front row. And what we're doing down there, we call it legal triage. So if we can engage in terms of criminal defense, or if we can engage in terms of vacator practice, we will. But most of the time, the women are coming to us with either non-legal issues or with other legal issues that take more time to address and people with different expertise. And so these are some of the top things that we've seen in our data that we've tracked over the last 2 years being there of the most primary concerns that survivors in that area face. These are things every attorney should know. These are all your constant responsibilities. Confidentiality is huge. Of course, you're going to be working to represent your client's best interest. But I put empower your client as the third one and the biggest one because that's really the goal of this, especially when you're doing something that you don't know if you're going to be successful. And who really does in law, in litigation? You can't always know if you're going to win the case. But if you can help your client feel empowered through that process, then you're somewhat winning, in my opinion. Okay, so those 5 tenets of trauma-informed care, we have a lot of overlap here with the American Bar Association's tenets of trauma-informed lawyering. Ultimately, the goal is to incorporate these 6 tenets, these 6 principles into your routine practice, your daily tasks, everything that you're doing for this client and any future clients as well. So again, you see client control being one of those major tenets. And I have a slide about client control. You can tell that I'm like a legal nerd. Everything is about the law. So attorneys have model rules of professional conduct. We have ethical rules that govern the way that we interact with our clients and with each other and with the judiciary. And so we do actually have a rule that says your client is in control. And I think for many victims and survivors, they've had experiences with the criminal justice system and other systems. They've had lawyers, they've had advocates, victim advocates, caseworkers. They've had people involved in their life, but never have they been in a position where they realize that you work for them, right? They're in control. This is what vacator practice is, a voluntary effort. And so I'd like to always explain to my clients that we will do what you want to do when you want to do it. You are in control now. I'm just as good as a paid lawyer. You are my client. And so we have to abide by our clients' decisions. We do have an implied authorization to take care of the legwork, but the client is the one who really drives the scope of representation. So trauma-informed lawyering really takes that idea and just puts it into overdrive. With that, I'd like to invite Tammy to talk about her experience working with professionals, not only myself, but other, attorneys and professionals.
Yeah, so I met Sarah and her team, Shay, when I was living in a safe house. I was living in a safe house in Philadelphia called Dawn's Place. And it's a year-long program, but they also extended it to a transitional house, which gives you an extra 6 months. But they don't force you out when your time is up, which is awesome because I was not ready to go. So they gave me extensions. I ended up staying. Throughout that time, I ended up getting a job at Covenant House of Pennsylvania. So I'm still living in Dawn's Place. I'm working at Covenant House, and I remember Sister Claudia and Sister Kathleen, the director, were like, "Oh, have you met Shay? She was just over at the other house." I was like, "No." I was busy working. I had 2 jobs at the time. I was working with horses in the morning, and I didn't. But they would always. I never took the time to go see Shay because one, I'm good at avoiding things. That's what I did in my past with my addiction and the trauma. I avoided addressing anything. I avoided getting honest with myself. I avoided any kind of footwork because I didn't want to do the work. I never wanted to do the work. It was overwhelming, and then that required me to project, and I couldn't even figure out what I was going to have for dinner that night. You want me to project what I'm going to do 6 months from now? I couldn't tell you. And that was overwhelming to me. So finally, a year into being at Dawn's Place, they actually got me to sit down at the dining room table, and I was like, all right, fine, I'll do it. But the big thing for me was I was ready at that point. I felt like, before when I would always try to get clean and sober, I would have 30 days and it would be like, all right, now I got to get the car, the kids, the house, the this, the that, the this, and I would rush into everything. But this time I took my time because I realized I processed things very slowly. So it took me about a year to finally sit down with them, and the main thing was not so much. I had to address my addiction first. For me, that was my problem. I always was compounded with all right, you have an addiction, but you also have trauma and you have mental illness and all these things that we have to fix at once. And this time I separated it. And it is co-occurring, but I had to take one step at a time. And I had to get my addiction under control first. And then I had to work on my mental health. And then I started working on the legal stuff. That was the traumatic part. I didn't want to have to go back to court. I didn't want to have to deal with law enforcement. I wanted to avoid all of that. But when I met Shay and Sarah, I felt a connection like almost immediately because of the transparency and everything was explained, not to the point where it was anything I didn't understand. You know, I'm not a lawyer. I don't know much about law other than how to break it. So at that point, I was willing to give it a try. What else do I have? You know, things were looking good in my life at the time. You know, I was employable now. So I was willing to give it a try. So we got the process started. So Shay had basically like set up the meeting and introduced me to Sarah, and then me and Sarah took it from there. But Sarah was so great. She was that's so important for me, which I didn't even realize until like looking back in hindsight, the transparency, how she explained every little thing. Like she emails always in contact with me saying, this is what I'm about to do. This is the response that I got. This is the person I contacted. Every little thing she kept me informed, and that made me feel comfortable. You know, like, okay, things are going. Every little thing she filed, she filled me in on. She copied me on emails, you know, and that kept me informed. But it also gave me a sense of relief, like things are working out, and I'm not overwhelmed with the whole process because I was reassured, and I also had the open mind and the acceptance that this might not work out, especially when it got to the affidavit. And it was, you know, you may, at this point, it was a written affidavit, but you may be called in to testify in court. And I was like, ooh, I was ready to stop it right there. Like, all right, we can send this in. If he wants me to come in, I'm just done. Like, that's where I was. But we have a great DA, and that requires was great. And I didn't have to do any of that. And my record was vacated. But throughout that process, there was two things that my charges, caused a problem for. One, when I went to move out of Dawn's place, I found a person that I could rent this house with in West Philly, and the landlord wouldn't allow me to be a tenant on the lease because I had a prostitution charge. So I was a legal occupant, but I was not a tenant, which turned out to be a plus in my situation at the end of that lease. But yeah, so that was kind of like really frustrating, and I was like, oh, I'm gonna write him a letter. I went to the office, like I'm in the process of getting this like expunged and stuff, and he's like, well, until then, no, you can't be a legal tenant. And then the second one, I ended up getting suspended from my job, and that really pushed the action through. My organization is primarily privately funded, but that I work in outreach, and that's funded through DHS in the city. So we were getting audited, and they decided maybe 8 months into my employment there, after I had done the FBI fingerprints and everything, that they were not okay with my charges, and that I am suspended immediately until these are taken care of. Otherwise, you're fired. So Covenant House really worked with me, and they kind of switched me into a different department and kept me working, which was great. Like, they really went to bat for me, and I'm so grateful for them. And it was so scary because we just got this audit again last week, and I was like, ooh, I got the papers. I got papers. Everything was good.
That part was complicated, and that's why even if you think you have access to all of your client's criminal history, do the FBI background, because what happened in Tammy's case was actually an arrest that did not result in a criminal case, and so it wasn't coming up on her statewide criminal history report. And so that was something we didn't catch at first.
There was no police report. I went to the district that it happened. They had no record of it.
Yep.
And even the FBI report said there's something there. We don't know what. We can't see it, but there's something. So let's figure that out. And we couldn't figure it out, but Sarah did.
The learning process.
Yeah. So there were some questions, but my phone just shut off. I was gonna.
What about interesting someone you didn't really know?
Oh, yeah. So having to tell my story to somebody I didn't know. So I mean, at this point, I was maybe about a year sober, so I mean, it's still hard for me, but it wasn't, like, if I was to jump right into that, right, like, from getting out of rehab, I don't think we would have progressed as well. I am still to this day working on my trust issues, and I do go to therapy, but I'm the type of person that's very defensive. I'm very closed off. I don't like to share my feelings. I don't like to get vulnerable in front of people. But I also learned about myself is that that's what's going to help me. You know, if I don't, then I'm just going to stay sick. And then I'm going to beat myself up like, oh, I should have took the opportunity when I had the chance. And then, you know, and I just wanted to do everything different in my life. And here's a perfect opportunity for something I never thought I would ever. I know for a fact to this day, I would have never done that on my own. I wouldn't have, like, I think I'm going to get my record expunged. Never. The thought of all of that work and going down to court and doing all that stuff, it was just like, no, so overwhelming. But
well, did you even know
somebody,
you had an option? I think that a lot of trafficking survivors don't even know that they can get their convictions taken off their record.
Well, I had an idea that there were some that I could work on, but I was like, because they had community legal service come to the rehab and like run a group and stuff, and I'm like, I don't even care. I don't even care. It's like not even a big deal to me. But then, you know, when it affected my job and my housing, I'm like, oh, we need to take care of this. And to have the support that I've had, you know, and it built from it. You know, I'm not her client any longer, but it went from attorney-client to now she's my friend and one of my major supports. And I'm just so grateful. I remember the first time I went, it was one of the first times I went to her office, and she was like so excited to see me, and she was like coming in for a hug, and she's like, wait, can I hug you? You know? Because you gotta, I don't know if anybody's learned in like trauma trainings that like you don't just like go and touch the survivor or the victim or whatever. You ask them. If you want to hug them, you ask first, because a lot of people don't like to be touched or hugged. So I was like, yeah, wait. But she's also gone above and beyond her services and helped me in other ways and taught me to be empowered and advocate for myself, and actually went to family court with me to help me get a divorce from my son's father, who was extremely abusive, who I hadn't been with for over 10 years. I just didn't have the knowledge of what to do. You know, I had gone online and printed all these papers, and I had no idea what any of it meant, and I didn't have the money. So she helped me with what's the waiver called?
The no-fault divorce?
No, the waiver for the application, because it was like a $400 application fee, and there was like a waiver if you didn't have the money.
Oh, in form of papyrus.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So she helped me get that. That was granted, and then she helped me fill out the paperwork, and I got my divorce and my vacators on the same year. So, yeah, it was a pretty. 2018 was hands down the best year of my life. Yeah. So, yeah, it's been for me. I don't know about anybody else, but it's been a great experience. One of the questions here, what does a vacator mean to you, and how do you think other survivors could benefit from it? You know, I remember the day that I got that first charge, and I was like, oh my God, I had such a bad run-in with the cops. You know, my mom was calling my cell phone at the same time, and the cop was like, oh, it says mom, I'm going to answer it. And I'm like, no. And the shame and the guilt, of that whole incident, it just hung over me like this darkness, and it just compounded the whole experience of the addiction. You know, it's like, God, you know, I have these charges. You know, I didn't care about the theft or the drug paraphernalia, but it was like, that looks so bad. Like, that's just so embarrassing. But it turned out to work well, because I got it off my record, and now I can go advocate to other people who have, excuse me, have the same problems, seeing issues, and who are too ashamed to confront it. And that's why I love the name of this workshop, Face It to Erase It, because you really have to face it in order to do anything about it, and that's not always easy. But if you have, I had such a great experience. I had, and it taught me to do other things. I got to meet Jamie, and I have to share this. I came here last year for the Survivor Symposium, not knowing anybody but Sarah and Shay. And I came with my coworker, and it was like included in the training for Covenant House. And I didn't know anybody. But in exactly 1 year, I came back, and I knew almost one person from every single table in that ballroom. And I was so excited to be able to, oh my God, I got so many people to say hi to now, because my support network has grown. From working with Shay and Sarah, I've been able to be in contact with other people, other organizations who might need somebody to speak for them. I've been able to speak at conferences with Sarah and with Shay. Last week I was with Shay. Yesterday I was with Sarah. And all these experiences have just been life-changing. And I'm just so grateful for it all. So, thank you.
We're glad. All right, I think we're out of time. We'll stick around if you guys have questions. Thank you. I think so.